Hey guys, how are you? Welcome to Intelligent Faith 315. My name is Pastor Jay. I run the website here. Glad to have you with us today. We're going to be continuing on with the series we've been doing for some time now, Good Arguments for God's Existence. We currently find ourselves in the cosmological argument from Leibniz. It's also known as the cosmological argument from contingency. So we're going to be continuing on with this argument today. I do hope that you guys have been tracking with it, and whether you're watching this at your computer, maybe listening to it on your iPhone or something like that, try to make a mental note of the different premises of the argument and just try to remember them and actually memorize them and some objections that come up to some of the premises. And the reason I say that is it can make this kind of an argument really practical, and you can use this as a good conversation tool when you talk to your friends, your family, your coworkers, or fellow students. And this kind of thing can really help people understand that some Christians really do think through their faith, and they really do want to express to folks that it's reasonable, it's rational, it's logical, and it just makes good sense to really believe in the Christian faith and a personal creator and a personal God. Also, just want to let you know that we've put up a couple of posts on Intelligent Faith 315 regarding some books that we've recommended for you guys. I think the last one was posted just a couple of days ago. It's usually a series of a couple of books, maybe 10 or so. Do encourage you to look through that list and maybe just think about getting one or two and just start to build up your own personal library. One book in particular that I would recommend would be An Introduction to Philosophy, A Christian Perspective. It's by Norman Geisler. You can buy the book brand new for probably, I don't know, between maybe $15 to $20, or you could get it used probably for around $5 off of Amazon. You can purchase it through the site, or you can just go directly to Amazon, whatever's more convenient for you. But I do encourage you to start doing some personal reading and investigation just into this field of philosophy as a Christian. And the reason is because it just seems that philosophy can just be such a powerful ally to the Christian. They used to say a couple hundred years ago that theology was the queen of the sciences, that theology, the study of God and contemplating God, was the queen of the sciences, but then that philosophy was what they called the handmaiden to theology. In other words, that philosophy, one of her main functions was to be kind of a servant to coming to theological conclusions and understandings, establishing doctrine, clarifying the truth as we believe it to be understood through theology. So just do encourage you as a Christian to begin to just do some reading on your own. Introduction to Philosophy, A Christian Perspective by Dr. Norman Geisler, and I think it's Mark Feinberg is a great place to start. You can get it off of our website or go to Amazon. It's a very good introductory level book to the field of philosophy. If you'd like something a little more advanced, if you're familiar with the field of philosophy, you might already have this book in your library, but if not, Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview. This is by William Lane Craig and J.P. Moreland. Outstanding, phenomenal book on philosophy. I'm still trying to work my way through it. I'm about 80% through it. It's very good. It's academic, so it's not really for you if you're totally unfamiliar with the field of philosophy, but it's absolutely phenomenal. It covers everything from universals to the mind-body problem to arguments of the existence of God, all kinds of subjects in philosophy, general, specific. It really is a broad, general book that's very well written, very well researched. Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview by William Lane Craig or J.P. Moreland, or Introduction to Philosophy, A Christian Perspective by Dr. Norman Geisler. So that's my plug for those two books. Want to encourage you guys just to get good resources from time to time. And so let's just get into this now. Again, we are going through good arguments for God's existence. So we have cosmological arguments that talk about the existence of the universe, focusing on different aspects of that, and from that we then argue our way back to the existence of God. Cosmological arguments will soon get into axiological arguments, which these are moral arguments for God's existence. There's also teleological arguments, which this is the design argument. There's a design argument that focuses on the fine-tuning of the universe, another one that focuses on terrestrial fine-tuning, the life conditions necessary for complex observers on planet Earth, and there's also a design argument for biological fine-tuning, cells, living systems, that kind of thing. So cosmological, axiological, teleological. We'll talk about the conceptual argument for God's existence, argument from consciousness. Really good stuff. So do encourage you guys as we go through these to just memorize some of the premises These are very short. They can be written out on a little piece of paper, on maybe like a little business card. You can stick them in your wallet, stick them in your back pocket. Keep them with you. Keep them close at hand. Or better yet, memorize them, hide them in your heart, put them in your mind, and they can serve as great conversation pieces. You don't have to go through them very formally. You can just introduce them kind of in a conversational way, and it's just a great way to really introduce people to the concept that it's more plausible to believe in the existence of God rather than not, and you can walk them through it, and the Lord may use these arguments to really grab a hold of somebody's mind, wipe away skeptical doubts, and remove skeptical roadblocks. And then after that, they might be able to be open to the gospel, be open to the message about Jesus, and they might actually come to the Lord. So I do encourage you to use this. This type of philosophical apologetics is absolutely biblical. We see much evidence of this in Old and New Testament. It's biblical, it's historical, because we see it used throughout church history with the early church fathers, Augustine, Aquinas. But then it's just very practical. It really, really does help people. I came to the Lord through this type of explanation and argumentation. The Holy Spirit used this kind of stuff and brought me to the Lord. So enough said about that. Let's just get right into it. Again, premise 1 from the cosmological argument from Leibniz. If you remember Wilhelm Leibniz, or Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, he was a German mathematician from the 1700s. He's the one that formulated this argument, and it's basically an answer to the question, why is there anything rather than nothing? This is a very fundamental question. I mean, sometimes we'll step outside of our door at nighttime, we'll go outside, and maybe you look up at the starry sky, and you would ask yourself, not why do things look so designed, not why is everything so beautiful, not why are things the way they are, but an even more basic and fundamental question than that, why is there anything rather than nothing? And this argument, this cosmological argument for God's existence, was formulated by Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz to answer that specific question. Why is there anything rather than nothing? And so, as we said, the first premise is, everything that exists has an explanation. Now that's just very simple right there. Everything that exists has an explanation for its existence. Pretty basic, fundamental premise. It seems logical, it seems to go along with our common sense, and it seems pretty intuitively plausible, right? But then as Leibniz continues to formulate the argument, he then could subdivide it into 2 categories of things that do exist, things that have an explanation. So you could say everything that exists has an explanation for its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. And so we spoke about this. So this would divide all beings, all creatures, all things into 2 categories. The category of necessary beings, or the category of contingent beings. So, and we briefly just tried to define what this category, necessary beings, was. We're very familiar with this category. Contingent beings, some would say dependent beings, is basically almost everything that we're familiar with. And so this category is very easy to understand. Pens, coffee cups, notebooks, tables, etc. These are all contingent beings. Not only did they not design themselves or create themselves, these objects did not bring themselves into being. They were brought into being, brought into existence, and then also sustained in their existence by something else. These contingent things, coffee cups, pens, tables, etc., do not have it within themselves to bring themselves into being, to cause themselves. The cause for their existence lies in an external thing, an external cause. So we're very familiar with this category, which Leibniz referenced in his first premise. Everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in an external cause or in the necessity of its own nature. And this, if you properly understand what is meant by the concept of God, especially the concept of the Christian God, this is one of the attributes of God. He is a necessary being. Now, this is more difficult for us to understand because, again, about 99.99% of everything that we are acquainted with falls into this category. But in contrast to that, a necessary being is something that it's impossible for this being to not exist. It's impossible for this being or thing or object to not exist. Or you could put it this way. The non-existence of this being is impossible. Its non-existence is impossible. Just like it is impossible for a contingent being to cause itself, or it's impossible that the reason for its existence lies within itself, so it is impossible for a necessary being to not exist. It doesn't have it within itself to not exist. It's not possible. Or another way that you could understand it, and this might help, is that in any possible world that you could imagine, any possible way that reality could have been, any set of conditions that you might imagine could describe reality, this necessary being would have to exist in every single possible world. In every single set of conditions that you could imagine for reality, this necessary being would exist. It is impossible for this being to not exist. Why must this be so? Well, because these contingent beings, if their existence is attributed to an external cause, well then it forms a chain. And so this contingent being or this contingent object is then caused by this one, which is caused by this one, and this one, and this one. And this cannot go back forever into infinity. It just absolutely can't. We know that we don't have an infinite amount of time, number one, and number two, an infinite regress, we never would have arrived at the present moment. And so there can't just be an endless infinite regress of contingent objects. There has to be something at the base of it as the foundation, the ground for all these contingent beings. But then, of course, if it's the ground, if it's the foundation, this being or this object cannot itself be a contingent being. So it therefore then falls into another category, which we call necessary beings. This is just, it just logically makes sense. If this is the case, if everything, almost everything that we are familiar with is a contingent object, you must eventually arrive at a necessary ground of being. That is the responsible being that gives existence and sustains all these other contingent beings in their own existence. So that's what we mean by a necessary being. Its non-existence is impossible, and in every possible world that you could imagine, it would exist. So those are some of the things that we talked about. Now, some people, not most Christians, they think that there are numerous types of necessary objects. For example, geometric shapes, certain axioms or rules of geometry or mathematics, the laws of logic, numbers. So there are certain people that believe that there are, a small number of necessary entities that exist. Certain mathematicians, according to whatever, philosophy of mathematics they hold to, they might agree that numbers actually exist. They might actually agree with that. Now, maybe something like what Plato suggested, where Plato, if you're familiar with him, you can download some of his books for free off the internet. Plato, he postulated there was this separate realm of existence, this world of the forms, and the perfect ideal, what he would call the archetype of, let's say, the number 7, actually exists there, and this is why everybody on earth has the ability to partake and share in the idea of the number 7, because the actual perfect form and ideal of 7, the actual number 7, kind of floats around in this world of the forms. That's what Plato believed. So he actually believed that it was an actual object that existed. So there are some people that believe in that, but that's really problematic for a Christian. I myself don't really believe that. We would rather think that those ideas, or those actual objects, those necessary truths, those are in the mind of God. And so for us as Christians, the only necessary being, the only necessary object is God himself. God, he doesn't just have existence and essence. God's essence is existence. So an essence is what something is, and existence is that something is. So I have a human essence, a human nature, and I also happen to exist. God is different. God has a divine nature, but with him, and this is how theologians and philosophers speak of this, that his essence is raw existence. So this is how some folks think about this, and one of the biblical verses, for example, that they would reference would be Exodus 3:14, where the Lord spoke to Moses and told him what? I am that I am. And he gave him this name, that God is pure actuality, raw being, and so forth. Some people might have a little different way of expressing that, but that God's essence is existence in and of itself. He is a necessary being. So we as Christians, we believe that the only being in this category of necessary beings is the triune God himself. And of course, this argument does not lead you to the triune God. It just leads you to God in general, and we will get to some of his attributes by the end of this argument today, but he's a necessary being. So it's impossible for this being not to exist. Exists in all possible worlds. His non-existence is impossible. So it seems intuitively correct. It just seems to make sense to us that everything that exists, it has an explanation for why it does exist. That does make sense to us. And so there really aren't any other categories besides contingent and necessary. Can't be necessary for everything. Ultimately, the chain of contingent beings must be grounded somewhere, so it's a necessary being. Some atheists have problems with this, and so we referenced last time that Richard Taylor, he throws out a good argument for understanding that even the universe itself, because this is usually the problem where, or the part where most atheists would disagree. Richard Taylor, he puts out an illustration, kind of a word picture, that helps illustrate the fact that even the universe itself needs an explanation and is not exempt from this principle of this causal principle, this principle of needing an explanation for your existence. So remember we talked about that? You're walking through the forest with your friend, and you're just walking through the forest, and you pass by a translucent kind of a glowing ball on the forest. And so in this word picture from Richard Taylor, the one friend turns to another friend and says, hey, wow, that's an interesting translucent glowing ball on the floor of the forest here. Amazing. I wonder what the explanation is of this ball. And the other friend says, well, that ball doesn't need an existence. It just is. It exists inexplicably. And then the other friend would say, well, come on. I mean, a translucent glowing ball on the floor of the forest just lying here? You think that there's no explanation? It doesn't need or require an explanation for its existence? You really believe that? And so then the other friend would then turn and say, well, I guess it does. I guess that kind of an object would require an explanation for its existence. So then in the same word picture, Richard Taylor then asks us to just merely increase the size of that glowing translucent ball from the size of, say, a basketball to, let's say, the size of a car. Would it still require an explanation for its existence? Well, absolutely, because merely increasing the size of the ball doesn't take away or diminish the fact that it needs an explanation for its existence. So then make it even larger than the size of a car. Make it, let's say, the size of a country. Would the ball still require an explanation for its existence? Yes. Increase it to the size of a planet. Would it still require an explanation for its existence? Absolutely. What if you then take that ball and increase it, let's say, to be the size of the universe? Would it still require an explanation of its existence? Yes. But it's precisely at that point where some atheists say, no, that makes me feel a little bit too uncomfortable. No, everything else needs an explanation for its existence. A basketball-sized glowing ball needs an explanation. If it's the size of a car, if it's the size of a house, the size of a country, or of a planet, all of those objects would require an explanation for their existence. But if you increase it to the size of the universe, no, that doesn't require an explanation for its existence. And this is just being selective. This is what you call, that's just an arbitrary choice. We referenced an atheist, Arthur Schopenhauer, from the 1800s, and he actually commented on that type of thinking, and he says you cannot do that. You cannot accept a principle, a law, and just go along with it until it doesn't suit you anymore, and then just kind of try to get out of it. He called that the taxi cab fallacy. You can't just call for a taxi and say, go along until you just feel like getting off, and then you just get out of the taxi. And so this metaphysical principle that everything that exists requires an explanation for its existence, you cannot allow the atheist to dismiss this principle simply because the universe is so large. Increasing the size of an object does not dismiss the need for this principle. Or we looked at it also the opposite way. Some atheists, they don't try to dismiss it by increasing the size of the object, but rather by diminishing the size of the object. So some atheists will say, well, that might be true about almost everything, but you know, there's subatomic particles such as quarks, for example, or maybe some folks would say strings or something of that effect, but most times they'll mention quarks. And they'll say, don't you realize that in the field of quantum physics and quantum mechanics that all sorts of bizarre things happen? In subatomic particles, we have discovered, according to the Heisenberg principle of uncertainty, they actually come in and out of existence inexplicably, out of nothingness. And so these types of atheists are going to try to pull that type of explanation on you to say that, you know, that principle is true for most everything except at the subatomic quantum level. That doesn't really hold true anymore, because we've just observed we've come a long way since Isaac Newton with Newtonian physics, and now with Einstein and his theory of relativity, and now into this quantum world, we see really bizarre things happening, and not everything really requires an explanation, especially at the subatomic level. Quarks come in and out of existence. And friends, this simply is not true. The Heisenberg principle of indeterminacy states that you cannot predict the speed and the location of an object at the same time, but it speaks nothing to the idea of particles can come in or out of existence without an explanation, number one, and number two, without a cause, because they don't come in or out of existence out of nothingness. What actually is happening is there are fluctuations in the vacuum energy that's there, but the vacuum is not nothing. This vacuum of energy is a fluctuating sea of energy endowed with a rich physical structure, and it's very substantial. So it is not nothing. So these particles simply go back and forth, and they change forms from energy to matter, from matter to energy, but it's not from nothingness. It's not without a cause, and it's certainly not without an explanation. So again, don't allow the world of quantum physics or quantum mechanics to be used as kind of an intellectual escape route to try to escape some of these premises and some of these principles that we know to be true. So again, everything that exists has an explanation for its existence, either in an external cause, because it's a contingent being, a contingent object, or in the necessity of its own nature. The universe is not exempt from this principle just because it's a large object, and small particles, quantum particles, are not exempt from this principle either, simply because of their minute size. And not even God is exempt from this principle. And this is something you can share with your atheist friends. Say, listen, you can't just say that this principle applies to everything in the world, everything in the universe, except the universe itself. That's the taxi cab fallacy. The universe itself is not exempt from this principle, because we as Christians, we aren't even exempting God from this principle. God also must have and does have an explanation for his own existence. Namely, what is that? He is a necessary being. Not that he is self-caused. You can't say that. That's a logically incoherent idea. That doesn't make any sense. That's really just a bunch of nonsense. To cause yourself, you would have to exist before you exist in order to cause your own existence. So the idea of a being self-caused, that doesn't really make a lot of sense. It's pretty incoherent. And so God is not exempt from this metaphysical principle either. He also has an explanation for his own existence. The fact that he is a necessary being. He is the actual ground of being for all other contingent beings. And so that is premise one. It seems to hold up. It's reflected in reality. It's intuitively correct, and it's more plausible than its opposite. It's more plausible than its negation, which would be what? Well, that things just exist inexplicably, without any reason, any explanation whatsoever. That doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, an atheist can claim that, and if they really want to escape the force of this argument, well, then that's what they'll do, and you can't really stop them. But that comes with what you call a high intellectual price tag. They're going to look pretty silly, and they're going to destroy their intellectual credibility by thinking like that. So, premise 1, we can accept it. And let's move on to premise 2 then. Premise 2 says, well, then if the universe has an explanation for its existence, well, then that explanation is God. Let me read it again. Premise number 1, everything that exists has an explanation for its existence, either in an external cause or in the necessity of its own nature. Premise number 2, well, if the universe has an explanation for its existence, well, then that explanation must be God. Now, you might think that this principle is a principle where the atheist would have a contention with you, okay? But actually, most atheists would take issue with premise number 1, and here's why. This principle, in a sense, has to be accepted by the atheist. Why do I say that? Because this premise, okay, if the universe has an explanation for its existence, well, then that explanation is God. That premise, that idea, that statement, is the logical equivalent of what the atheist already says. What is the atheist saying? The atheist is saying, well, the universe has no explanation for its existence because there is no God. So it is the logical equivalent. It means the same thing. We say as Christians that the universe has an explanation for its existence, and that explanation is God. The logical equivalent of that for them is the universe has no explanation for its existence. There is no God. And so we're basically just saying the same thing logically. Either one or the other is true. There's a logical kind of equivalence there. And so they can't really argue with that. It's really the same type of thing. So there's logical equivalence. It's a logically equivalent claim. The truth claim of that premise is logically equivalent to the truth claim of what the atheist is already saying. But there's another reason to believe that premise, and this is all we do. We are simply examining the premises of these different arguments, and if the premise is logically valid, if it is true, if it's plausible, if you can't find any weaknesses in that sense with the premise, then you simply proceed to the next premise. And if all the premises, especially in a deductive argument, are true, then the conclusion follows inescapably and necessarily. So that's all we're doing, is just going through the premises and trying to see if we can find a mistake. So that premise, if the universe has an explanation for its existence, that explanation is God. It's the logical equivalent of what the atheist is already claiming, that the universe has no explanation because there is no God. We simply say, well, if the universe has an explanation, well, then that explanation is God. But there's an additional reason for you to believe that. Why? Imagine what a being would have to be like to be the explanation for the universe coming into being, coming into existence. So ask yourself, just real quick, when I take a drink here, what do we mean when we use the word universe? Well, really, and a lot of you are aware of this, when we use the word universe, and by the way, that word universe simply means there is a unity and a diversity at the same time that we observe in the universe. And it seeks to answer that old philosophical problem of the one and the many, Parmenides and Heraclitus, these ancient Greek philosophers. But that doesn't mean anything to you if you're not interested in ancient Greek philosophy. But so when we use the word universe, what do we mean? Well, time, space, and matter and energy, right? That's basically what we mean. All of time, all of space, and all of matter and energy, which are basically just two different forms of the same thing. That's what we mean when we say the universe. And so if the universe, in other words, if all of time, all of space, all of matter has an explanation for its existence, well, then that explanation must be God. Why? Well, because to be a sufficient explanation for the universe, what would this being have to be like? Okay, well, just ask yourself, if this being created all of time, it would have to be what? It would have to be timeless. If this being created all energy, it would have to be what? Well, it would have to be tremendously, tremendously powerful. If this being was the source of every contingent, dependent being that we spoke about in this category, what would it have to be? Well, then it would have to be a necessary being. And so, as you start to examine this idea, the cosmological argument for contingency from Leibniz, it leads us to a being who is timeless, incredibly powerful, and he is the necessary being that exists and forms the foundation for the existence of every other thing, every other being in reality. And then, of course, it would have to also be a personal being, because it would have had to have made a decision at some point in the past to create the actual physical universe. If it's outside of time, it would also be outside of space. So we also have there a spaceless being. If it's outside of the material realm, it would be an immaterial being. As we said, if it created all energy and matter, it would itself be an incredibly powerful being. And if it created all contingent or dependent objects, it would have to itself be a necessary object. And so what you actually then come to is a timeless, immaterial, incredibly powerful, necessary being. But the only being that we know of that can exist timelessly and spacelessly, well, it would be one of two things. It would be either something like a number, something like a necessary being like a number, which not everybody agrees with, and certainly we as Christians, we don't really agree with that. But if it's not a number, then what would the only other thing be that would be timeless and spaceless, outside of time and space and immaterial? Well, it would have to be an immaterial, unembodied mind. That's what it would have to be. Numbers can't cause anything anyway, right? Even if Plato was right, and outside of this world there was this other type of existence where there were actual numbers floating around, but the number 7 can't actually cause anything to come to be. And so a disembodied, immaterial, all-powerful mind that can have causal relations, or it can cause things to happen because it is a mind, it has a choice, it has a volition. And this is what actually happened. And so again, this cosmological argument from Leibniz is very incredible, because it doesn't just lead us to some weak idea, some concept that approaches God, but rather it leads us to a timeless, spaceless, immaterial mind, incredibly powerful, and a necessary being that is the absolute foundation and explanation for the existence of everything else that we see in the universe. And that is what we mean when we as Christians say God. So this is incredibly powerful stuff here, folks. And again, this is why I'm trying the best I can. I know that I'm probably failing in some regards, but I'm trying the best I can to help you understand how powerful this type of reasoning can be, because it leads to such fundamental and dramatic conclusions. You can actually help somebody see, if they're open to thinking and reasoning and arriving, hopefully, at the truth. These are fundamental questions of reality. And if you follow them through step by step and trace them back, it will lead us not only to an explanation of the universe, but that explanation of the universe is God, a timeless, spaceless, immaterial, incredibly powerful mind who is also the necessary being that upholds the existence of all other things in the universe. Incredible. So again, let's go through it again. Premise number 1, everything that exists has an explanation for its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. Premise number 2, if the universe has an explanation for its existence, that explanation is God. Why? Because that statement, that premise, is the logical equivalent of the atheist truth claim that if the universe has no explanation, then God doesn't exist. It is the logical equivalent truth claim of that. Secondarily, for something to be the explanation of the universe, what kind of qualities would that being have to have? It would have to have the qualities that we assign to God. Timelessness, spacelessness, incredible power, necessary being, etc. Personal mind outside of the universe. Premise number 3, the universe exists. Now that's the third premise. So if premise number 1 is successful, if premise number 2 holds tight logically and in terms of its truth claim, if it's plausible, then we progress now to premise number 3, the universe exists. Now, might somebody deny that? Might somebody tell you, well, the universe doesn't exist? Well, they might. They might actually tell you that the universe doesn't exist. Who would that be? Well, it could be somebody that may have watched The Matrix one too many times, and they might think that it's an illusion. It might be somebody, let's say, from Hinduism or from one of the Far Eastern religions. In Hinduism, there's a doctrine known as Maya, that all of reality is simply an illusion. You don't really exist, I don't exist, and this is part of our problem. We need to unlearn the deception that has crept into our minds, realize this is all an illusion, and yoke ourselves with Brahman, with the all, etc., etc. Or you might run into somebody who believes in something known as solipsism, someone who is a solipsist, and they believe that the only person that exists is themselves and that everything else is really just sustained in their own mind. Everything else is kind of a figment of their own imagination. So the chances you're going to run into somebody like that who's very dogmatic in asserting that is pretty low. But even if you did, well, that still wouldn't undercut the truth of this argument, right? Because the illusion of Hinduism, the imagination of the solipsist, or even just the Matrix idea, they would still need an explanation for the illusion, an explanation for the person doing the imagining, an explanation for the matrix itself. You see, you cannot escape this really, because this is not a physical principle, it's a metaphysical principle, just crying out for this truth that everything that exists needs an explanation for its existence. And so that premise also holds true. The universe exists. And so, friends, if premise number 1 is true, that everything that exists has an explanation for its existence, either in an external cause or in the necessity of its own nature, premise number 2, if the universe has an explanation for its existence, that explanation is God. Premise number 3, then, the universe exists. What is the obvious conclusion that follows logically and inescapably? That the explanation for the universe is God. And there you have it. That is the cosmological argument from Leibniz, also called the cosmological argument from contingency. And really, guys, one of the only other ways that an atheist could try to deny this argument would be to do the following. They could backtrack all the way up to premise number 1, and they could say, you know what? I agree with premise number 1, that everything that exists has an explanation for its existence. But you know what? The universe itself is a necessary being. In other words, it is impossible for the universe to not exist. That's one of the only final ways, one of the last-ditch intellectual attempts that an atheist could come up with to try to escape from the logical force of this argument, is to say, well, you know what, I take it all back. Let's go back to premise 1, and I agree with premise 1 that everything has an explanation for its existence, either as a contingent object or as a necessary object. But you know what? The universe is a necessary object. If the atheist doesn't just want to say, well, it just exists inexplicably, and deny premise 1, he would then be forced to say, well, the universe is a necessary being. In other words, they would be claiming that it's impossible for the universe to not exist. That's what they would be claiming. That the universe must exist, that it's impossible for the universe to not exist, and that in any set of conditions that we could imagine for reality, in other words, in any possible world that you can imagine, or any possible world that could have existed, the universe would have to exist. That's what they'd be actually saying. And that just won't hold water, folks, because we can conceive of a reality in which the universe didn't exist. I can conceive of a universe without time, of a world, of an existence, of a state of affairs without time, or without matter, or without energy. That's one reason why that can't be true. And another reason why that can't be true is because for something to be a necessary object, a necessary being, right? An object that it's impossible for it not to exist, one of the things that must be true about this object is that it must be eternal. Eternal in the past and eternal in the future. And take a wild guess what modern science has demonstrated about the physical structure and makeup of the universe. It is finite. It had its point of origin and point of beginning at a finite point in the distant past. If you agree wholeheartedly with the Big Bang, that'd be about 13.7 billion years ago. But the point is that modern science, secular, non-Christian, atheistic science, just raw science itself, has demonstrated in about 5 or 6 different ways that the universe is itself not an eternal being, that it had its beginning at some point in the finite past. Through Edwin Hubble's discovery of the expansion of the universe, Einstein's theory of relativity, the background radiation, and then also in 2003, the Borg-Guth-Vilenkin theory stated that any universe that is on average expanding at some point throughout its history, that universe must have a finite point of beginning. It's called the Borg-Guth-Vilenkin theory, formulated in 2003 by these 3 scientists, Borg, Guth, and Vilenkin, and it states that the universe is not eternal. It definitively, scientifically has been demonstrated that it has a point of origin in the finite past. And so the atheist has no recourse, cannot say that the universe itself is a necessary being or object. If it's not a necessary object, then guess what it is? It's a contingent object. If it's a contingent object, guess what? It needs a necessary being as an explanation for its own existence. And if a necessary being that is the existence of the universe, that necessary being would be timeless, spaceless, immaterial, incredibly powerful, and it would be a being whose essence is existence, and it's impossible for this being to not exist. And those are some of the qualities, some of the attributes that we mean when we use the word God. So I've talked quite a bit. Hopefully it was slow enough for you to follow. I encourage you guys to try to listen to this again. Write down the premises. Memorize it. Practice it. It's 3 premises with 1 logical conclusion. And let me just tell you again, guys, if there are no mistakes or errors within the premises of a deductive argument, a deductive syllogism, then the outcome follows inescapably and logically. It is a necessary conclusion that follows from those premises. And so you've got a good, airtight argument that God is the sufficient explanation for the existence of the universe. That concludes our first good argument for God's existence. And then next week we'll move on to another one, probably to another very popular cosmological argument known as Kalam. This comes from Muslim thinkers such as Al-Ghazali and Christian thinkers known as Saint Bonaventure. So we'll move on to that. It's a very popular argument these days. I encourage you guys to review this stuff. Guys, do me a favor, forward some of the material, invite some of your friends to come check out Intelligent Faith 315. Definitely if they're Christians, so this can strengthen and help them in their faith, but especially if they are non-Christians, atheists, agnostics, skeptics, just people who are interested in trying to answer some of the fundamental questions of life. And maybe some folks that wonder, are there any good reasons to believe the Christian worldview? Are there any good reasons to suppose that the Christian philosophy, the Christian faith might actually be real? Are there any good reasons, are there any good arguments to believe in the existence of a personal creator God? Pass it on, okay? Until next time, guys, have an intelligent faith.